Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Better Buildings Alliance Renewables Integration Team Call. I'm just going to dive in today. We have a number of attendees already online, which is great, and I'm sure we'll see more coming on as we move forward. This is Rose Langner from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm the technical lead for this Better Buildings Alliance team, and today we have a really exciting call talking about valuing and incentivizing demand flexibility as a grid asset. We're going to hear from two speakers, including Tom Ekman, who is the former director of the Power Division of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, and a nationally recognized expert in integrated resource planning and energy efficiency. He's now a consultant to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And then we will also hear from Margot Everett, who also comes from a wealth of experience. She worked as a senior director in analysis and rates at Pacific Gas and Electric, and is now the director of energy, sustainability, and infrastructure at Guidehouse. Next slide. For anyone new to these calls, the Better Buildings Alliance serves as a platform for commercial building owners, managers, and industry partners to share and deploy innovative, cost-effective, and energy-saving solutions, as well as connect to technical experts on particular topics around building energy. Next slide. And our renewables integration team focuses on the strategic integration and use of renewables in our commercial building stock. But we've really shifted to focusing on building load flexibility and grid coordination to understand how our building stock can become an asset to our power grid, which is what we're really going to be talking about today. And our aim is to provide resources, information, and guidance on these topics to you, better buildings or building owners and managers, and anybody else who joins in on these calls or keeps up with the information that we're producing. And we also look to our membership for input on new possible research areas or resources that might be needed to help make better decisions on these topics as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always happy to engage on conversations within the renewables integration team focus. Next slide. Today's agenda, really quick. I'm going to do some short announcements. Then we'll dive into our technical presentations from Tom Ekman and Margot Everett. They'll be discussing some information that's in these two recent publications that I have linked here on the slides, and we will be sending the slides out after the call. And then hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end for discussion and Q&A. And for this, I ask, please use the chat function. And you can use it throughout the call to ask questions, and we will try to get to it at the end. Next slide. And just to familiarize yourself with our technical research team here, and I realize the title of this slide should be changed here, but the Renewables Integration team is led by myself. I'm a senior research engineer at NREL, and also my colleague Joyce McLaren, who is also a senior research engineer at NREL and is on the line, and she'll be helping us with the Q&A at the end of the call. Next slide. Actually, you can advance too. So I'll dive into some announcements here. First, just so everybody is aware, I like to point out that Department of Energy has what I like to call a Geb Site. This is a website that hosts all of the DOE-funded information around grid interactive efficient buildings. So I have the link here on the slide. If you Google DOE Geb, this site will pop up on your browser at the top. Has a lot of great information that we've been creating from all the national labs that's funded from Department of Energy. Next slide. Other projects I want to highlight here, one in particular is the General Services Administration, GSA, and Department of Energy do a joint request for information on new technologies through the GSA Proving Ground Program and the DOE High Impact Technology Catalyst Program. So 2 years ago, we had a solicitation for GEB, Grid Interactive Efficient Building Software Solutions. These are overarching supervisory control solutions that can control multiple building end uses in multiple load flexibility modes. That means not just energy efficiency, but how can we shed and shift load in a building. This is a link to the news release that was put out there and the 4 companies that were selected for demonstration. These field studies are underway right now, and the M&V, the measurement and verification, is being led by a number 4 of the national labs, NREL, Lawrence Berkeley, Pacific Northwest, and Oak Ridge. So coming soon, they're kicking off. We're still in early phases, but I would say in a year and a half or a year or so, we'll start to see some results on how do these Geb software solutions actually work in real buildings, boots on the ground. So that's exciting. Next slide. Also coming soon and sooner than those field studies. If you guys are familiar with this, in 2019, the Rocky Mountain Institute published a report called The Value Potential for Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings in the GSA Portfolio. We've been working with RMI to expand the study to look at different types of portfolios of buildings. So we've focused on a big box retailer, and then also a portfolio owner of multifamily buildings. We are close to be done complete with this analysis, and we're really excited to share the results from these 2 different portfolios with you as well. And down the road, we plan to connect the dots a little bit more between all of these analyses to understand what Geb solutions really work in what types of buildings and where across the country, etc. So exciting new research coming down the pipe. And next slide. This is my last announcement here, just so everybody is aware. On the Better Buildings Solutions Center, we have a website dedicated to our on-demand Better Buildings webinars. So on this website, you can search for the Renewables Integration Team and take a look at all of our past webinars we've produced. This webinar is being recorded as well, and we will put this up on this website. So if you do need to access this or want to share it with anybody else, please go to this website and you can find all of our webinars that we've produced in the past. Okay, great. Next slide, I'm going to launch into some introductions, and you can forward one more. So again, our speakers are Tom Ekman and Margot Everett. Really excited to have them both on this call. As formal introductions here, Tom Ekman, again, he's a former director of the Power Division of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. Tom is a nationally recognized expert in integrated resource planning and energy efficiency with nearly 40 years of experience. He now serves as a consultant to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Mr. Ekman was intimately involved in the development of all 7 of the council plans. He led the development of the council's 7th power plan and conducted comprehensive assessments of the region's energy efficiency potential for its first 6 regional power plans. Tom represents the council in federal efficiency standards, proceedings, and negotiation. And Mr. Ekman chaired the council's regional technical forum from its formation in 1999 through 2015. In 2015, the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance recognized Mr. Ekman with its first Lifetime Achievement in Energy Efficiency Award, naming the award in his honor. Tom is also a recipient of the Bonneville Power Administrators Excellence Award for Outstanding Public Service, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economies Champion of Energy Efficiency Award, and the Northwest Energy Coalition's Headwaters Award. So Tom, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to quickly introduce Margot as well. Margot Everett also comes from a wide breadth of experience here. She works as a director at Guidehouse's Energy Practice, providing strategic and analytic regulatory consulting services to investor and publicly owned utilities, market participants, and regulators in electric and gas. Margot has nearly 35 years of experience in the energy and utility sector, leading rate and regulatory analytics, risk management, and wholesale contract structuring organizations. So thank you both so much. I think this is going to be an excellent panel, great presentations, and I hope everybody enjoys this. So moving on to the next slide, I'll hand it over to Tom. You can probably advance one more too.
Thank you, Rose. Well, why don't we just get right into it? The introduction is that we've got three reports that were done through C Action. If you'll just go down the list there, we've got 3 reports on grid interactive building, and the first one was an introduction to state and local governments, giving an overview of what GEBs are and what some of the benefits to the system and to customers might be. The second one, which I'll focus on today, was determining the value proposition to utilities of grid interactive benefits. And a third one that Steve Schiller developed is on measuring those benefits so that we can get them quantified and then to the potential benefit of both customers and utilities to monetize those benefits once they're documented. So we're going to spend the rest of the presentation on the second report. All of these are available on the LBNL website and on DOE's website. So next slide, please. So this particular report focuses on the methods and practices for determining the economic value of demand flexibility to electric utility systems. It provides information that will help in designing programs, market rules, and the basic intent is to align the economic interest of utilities with those of its customers, so both can see the right signals, both financially and for program design, rate design, and other uses. Jurisdictions can use this document and it's to sort of develop their procedures as the foundation for understanding the value proposition for GEBs, and then build on that if they have other benefits in addition to the utility system benefits that align with the policy objectives they may have that include potential non-utility system benefits. So again, it's intended to provide guidance for state and local policymakers, utility regulators, state energy offices, utilities, and other stakeholders engaged in the process of moving GEBs forward in the marketplace. Next slide, please. So to make it very clear, the focus of this is a graphic from EPRI that looks at all the benefits that GEBs might produce. And if we look at the next, add one more, we're looking at this in this report specifically at the upper half of this graph, which is to identify things that might reduce generation costs for the utility system or reduce delivery, transmission, and distribution costs for the utility system. Others will take on the benefits to customers and their societal impacts, but the focus of this report was largely on being able to quantify what the utility system benefit package looks like. Next slide, please. So let's start with what the challenges are. First of all, we've got limited analytical capability. We've got declining costs for energy efficiency and demand response. Increasing levels of storage and other DERs provide an opportunity for utilities to use those as a substitute for conventional resources in their grid planning and operations, and look at those investments as an alternative that might be less expensive to produce those services than standard resources. To do so, utilities have to be able to evaluate multiple options, including those that they've never evaluated before, in an organized and technology neutral way. And right now, there is limited capability to do that across the transmission, generation, and distribution systems. Next slide, please. So what we have is a lack of parity in the cost effectiveness analysis during the planning process and then later on in implementation. For most utilities, the economic valuation of DERs and GEBs in particular is generally not equivalent to the way they evaluate their traditional utility scale resources. This lack of parity introduces a bias in the economic analysis and potentially understates the benefits of those resources, and it doesn't allow them to compete on an even playing field in terms of achieving goals that the state or utility might have for resilience, security, and affordability of energy services. Next slide, please. So this is a little excerpt from a movie dialogue that came out in 1967, which was the year I graduated from high school, by the way. And basically, the emphasis here is that there is a subset of all energy efficiency measures that can go into buildings and industrial facilities and other, even in agriculture, that rely on controls. And those are the ones that we're interested in terms of evaluation for GEBs, because in order to provide a utility system benefit, specifically with respect to interaction with the grid, those systems have to be able to turn on and turn off on the basis of some signal, whether that's an economic signal or a command and control signal from somebody that's got a switch or a power button or a joystick. And that means that not all energy efficiency is subject to grid interactivity. What we're talking about those that can respond in some way to a signal. So the focus of this paper was really about a subset of all those things that might be done in buildings to improve their efficiency, specifically those that respond to controls from some way, some type of signal. Next slide, please. So the value proposition historically is based on avoided costs. So traditionally, economic value for utility system services, energy efficiency, demand response, and other DERs really look at the avoided cost of conventional resources. The underlying principle there in this process is that the value of something, a utility system service, can be approximated by looking at the cost of acquiring the next most expensive thing. So if you've got something that's slightly less expensive than the next most expensive thing, its value is avoiding the purchase of that next most expensive thing. So that's the concept of avoided cost in a nutshell. And so next slide, please. The task we have before us and what this paper addresses, what this report addressed, is the primary effort that has to be undertaken for demand flexibility to establish its value is to identify what that alternative resource is and then establish what its avoided cost might be. So there are a variety of methods used across the country to do so. They vary by electric market structure, so you have regulated markets, vertically integrated markets, and you have organized markets where you've got a wholesale provider, DGM or New England ISO, and retail distribution networks, local service providers that provide the retail service. Those market structures produce different results when you look at avoided resources and how those are established. The available resource options vary across the country and their costs vary across the country. You've got some areas where wind and solar are widely available and highly economic, and other regions where solar's, like in the northern tier states, a little less attractive during the winter, particularly in the Northwest where I live, where it's raining today and pretty much will be for the next 6 months. So you have differences in availability resources, which influence what resources options you might have and their cost. And then state energy policies and regulatory context also influence what resources can be available. You've got states with energy efficiency performance standards, you've got states with renewable portfolio standards, and those influence what the avoided cost of particular resources might be and their availability. So there's more about this in more detail in the report and in some slides in the backup to my presentation today. Next slide, please. So there are several here. There's no single value for demand flexibility of energy efficiency, or for that matter, any other DER in utility systems. The value of a single unit of service, whatever that happens to be, is a function of its timing, that is the impact in basically the temporal load profile when the benefit occurs, the location of that benefit in the interconnected grid, both transmission and distribution, the specific grid service it provides. We have services that provide peak capacity. We have services that might provide voltage stability. Those are not the same service, and they are valued differently. The expected life, how long this particular resource will persist, because if people are responding to price signals, that price signal might influence their behavior differently through time. If people are responding to incentives, those incentives and the measures installed in the building may change through time. And so the persistence is an important factor here. And the avoided cost of the least expensive alternative, that's the sum of all those other things. So the valuation that we're looking at for energy efficiency and demand response and GEB services need to account for all the above variations, both across the country through different markets, and as well as through these major influences on what the benefit package looks like. Next slide, please. So we've got 4 primary methods now in practice of evaluating energy efficiency and other DERs, including their GEB components. The most prevalent, probably, at least in non-restructured markets, are system capacity expansion and market models. And even in the restructured markets, many utilities rely on market models. The most prevalent practice in using those models is to simply run a load forecast that is reduced by the energy efficiency or demand response or GEB impacts, and build that into the load forecast, and then let the model optimize the type, amount, and schedule of new conventional resource development, for whether that's generation, transmission, or distribution. A less common practice is to allow the distributed energy resources, including GEBs, to compete with those conventional resources directly in the model, so that there's a one-on-one competition between traditional resources, conventional generation and transmission, distribution resource options, and the DERs, and let them determine, let that model optimize the type, amount, and timing of conventional resource development in competition with the DERs. So that's less prevalent, and we'll talk more about that second option later in the resource presentation. A second option is competitive bidding or auctions. So we use market mechanisms to select which new DERs get constructed and use that as a proxy for their value. It's currently limited to energy efficiency and demand response in most markets. You see the EE auctions and demand response auctions competing, or resources competing in auctions from PJM and MISO. Proxy resources, this is where we a priori establish what we think will be the alternative resource to provide a particular grid service. So in the example here, a natural gas-fired simple cycle turbine might be the default resource to provide peaking capacity in many utility service territories on a going forward basis. That might change as we see other resource options show up, but pretty conventional choice is to use the price and the cost of a simple cycle turbine to look at the value of providing peak benefit reductions through DERs. It's pretty frequently adopted when there's no modeling involved. It's just a standalone analysis. And then a fourth option is to basically establish the value through an administrative or public policy determination. So you use a legislative or regulatory process to establish the development goals. So when we set, for example, renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency portfolio standards at a given level, whether that's 15% for renewables or 1.5% of loads for energy efficiency resource standards, we de facto establish what their avoided value is. Simply because you've said you've got to build this many, and in order to do that, you have to buy up to so much resource, and that establishes what their marginal value is because you build those into your portfolio. So next slide. The current methods have limitations and gaps. When we look at restructured markets, not all DERs and certainly not all GEBs are eligible to participate in those markets. Not all utility system values and benefits are reflected in the market value because most of these focus on the bulk power system. So we're not capturing the locational value of avoided transmission and distribution capacity. We're not capturing the value of distribution system losses, because this is set at the bulk value, so those losses are not captured, nor the value of resilience, for example. In some markets, we're not recognizing their long-term value. Measures may persist longer than they're being paid for. For example, in PJM, they compensate energy efficiency and demand response up to 4 years, regardless of measure life, assuming that those impacts of energy efficiency and demand response that they've been paying for 4 years ultimately get captured, and they're embedded in the econometric load forecast they use to determine resource need. So that's an administrative structure that limits their value proposition. One has to be careful that you don't confuse or conflate the value of something with the price being paid for it. The cost of a measure and its value, which might turn out to be beneficial for 15 years, even though it's only paid for 4, is not the same as truncating its value. It's demonstrating its full value, because you've missed another 11 years of its benefit. Next slide, please. When we get to restructured or non-restructured markets, those utilities where we've got vertically integrated states, which about 30 some odd states require integrated resource planning, whether they're vertically integrated or not. So I would include all those states that do that kind of long-range planning. Not all utilities or states require that all system benefits of DERs are included. Some include time varying, locational values, risk mitigation, resilience values. Others do not. Not all states or utilities consistently quantify what those benefits are. Even if they had the same list of benefits, they may do the quantification quite differently. Some use marginal distribution line losses to gross up impacts of generation to the transmission system. Others use average system losses. Some use no losses at all. The accuracy of load shapes vary widely, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. Resource options analyzed often fail to account for the potential interaction between DERs, particularly the impact of energy efficiency and demand response potential, or the impact on storage and on distribution generation load shapes and potential. Typical resource optimization models embed DERs in the load forecast, so they don't capture the potential interaction with those of DERs with the existing and potential future resource development. And commercially available models are, at this moment in time, limited, but improving their capabilities to model DERs. You have some models that do a pretty good job of demand response, because they've been doing, for example, pump storage for years, so demand response can look a lot like pump storage when you model it, and same way with battery storage. So they have some capabilities there, but their timestamp or time fidelity typically isn't run at a level where you see some of the grid benefits of demand flexibility. Many are run on typical days or typical hours. They're not run sub-hourly because the optimization time takes too long. So these models, while they may have the capability, are not deployed in a way that you can capture some of the sub-hourly benefits you might get through grid interactive buildings. Next slide, please. So let's look at some examples of the problem. There are many, but we'll give you 4 examples so you can take those away. Not using accurate load shapes to determine time value of savings and benefits, not accounting for distribution and transmission system capacity impacts, not accounting for the interaction between DERs, individual DERs, energy efficiency measures, storage, and distributed solar PVs have interactions if they're not accounted for. Energy efficiency demand response have interactions if they're not accounted for. You've missed some important characteristics, and not accounting for the variations in interactions between DERs and the existing or future power resource needs, conventional resources. So let's take a look at some of these examples to get a better foundation. So using inaccurate load shapes can impact the evaluation of DER resource options, both for energy and peak valuation. So let's look at this next graph. What we have here is a 24-hour load shape of domestic hot water heating, or excuse me, of residential lighting. So this blue area is when the lights are on, and it peaks at around hour 21 or so. The red area is an assumed load shape that was being modeled by a utility. And when you integrate all of the values of every hour through the course of the year, you get a total annual value in terms of for the red area, about $75 a megawatt hour in present value terms. When you look at the actual metered load shape, you only see a value of residential lighting savings in this particular service territory of 56 megawatt hours, because what they've done is concentrate both the capacity and energy savings over only 3 hours a day, rather than over the entire day. Residential lighting turns out to be used all 24 hours a day, more or less. But if you've got the wrong load shape, you may either over or understate the benefits of particular energy efficiency measure or demand response. So getting the empirically derived or metered load shapes is important as an underlying assumption in the analysis. Next slide, please. When we look at the potential interaction between DERs, you might select a higher or lower cost or non-optimized resource strategy because you haven't looked at the interaction between the DERs. So this particular slide is developed from data that we put together in the 7th Power Plan for the Northwest that looks at the interaction between demand response and energy efficiency. And so on the vertical axis is the amount of peak capacity developed over a 20-year forecast period. The red bar here, showing up first, is the amount of energy efficiency acquired if we limited energy efficiency acquisitions to just market price. That is, the avoided cost is avoiding the next hour's purchase, short-run market price. So it has a basically the dispatch cost serve as a limitation of how much energy efficiency you would build. The next line, green line, is how much energy you filled if you include both energy and capacity purchases, that is the avoided capital cost of building new increments of capacity. So you have now a long run avoided cost for energy efficiency, and those are the number of megawatts. It almost doubles from 5,000 to 9,000 megawatts, depending upon what you assume is your cost effectiveness criteria. So while those impacts are pretty significant for energy efficiency, they also impact the amount of demand response that might be developed. So if you add the next two lines, please. We have two lines that show the amount of demand response built under the same conditions. So demand response in the green line goes up to about 2,000 megawatts of capacity by the time you get to 2034, whereas the red line goes up to around 3,000 megawatts of capacity. The red line represents the scenario under which you're paying setting the avoided cost for energy efficiency at short-run market prices. What happens when you do that is you definitely impact the amount of demand response. More gets built because more capacity is needed and it's not being provided by energy efficiency. When you look at the green line for energy efficiency and the dashed green line for demand response, one goes up, the other goes down. And what happens is when you build more energy efficiency, a portion of the value of energy efficiency is being offset by its capacity benefits. And so you get benefits from avoided purchases in the marketplace for energy efficiency, and that reduces its cost of capacity. If you don't look at these as an integrated way, you might build the wrong amount of each resource. And so modeling these as competitive resources inside a capacity expansion model reveals these interactions, whereas you wouldn't get those if you just did them offline. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the impact of DERs on other utility resources. So this particular slide, again from the 7th Power Plan, looks at the impact on the amount and timing of combined cycle combustion turbine development, depending upon the level of demand response and energy efficiency development. So if we add the first line, please. So vertical axis here again is capacity. In this case, just the capacity of a combined cycle turbine or combined cycle turbines in the plan. So the red line represents how much capacity would be added in the form of combined cycle turbines if we acquired no demand response and acquired energy efficiency up to its long run avoided cost. Orange line represents buying energy efficiency up to its short run market price with demand response included. And the blue line, the last line, looks at how much capacity would be added in the form of the turbine if you looked at avoided cost in the long run for energy efficiency and included demand response. And you can see each one of these scenarios develops a different amount of capacity, and more importantly, really influences the amount of capacity that's purchased in the near term. If you have no demand response in your portfolio and you acquire, even if you acquire EE at long run avoided cost, you end up building 1,000 megawatts of new combined cycle turbine by about 2020 or so, 2021, or needing that amount. On the other hand, if you include both demand response and avoided energy efficiency at its long run avoided cost, you push that out about a decade 9-10 years out to 2028 or so, 2029 before you need the first capacity. So not having those integrated functions inside a capacity expansion model may not reveal which of these options is the least expensive option. You could simply have one of these paths show up in your forecast by load reduction, and you wouldn't know whether the alternatives were a better or a lower cost option or perhaps lower risk option. Next slide, please. So we've got 7 recommendations in the report. Why don't you put all 7 up? I think they just come clicking down here. We want to account for all utility system economic benefits. That's the header. We need to, in order to do that, we need to account for when the savings occur from energy efficiency and demand response. We need to account for the impact on the distribution system savings on transmission and generation value. You start with the distribution system and work up to the generation system through the transmission system, so you capture all the benefits at the end use level and then work up from there, because losses accumulate through time and the benefits magnify through location. We need to account for variation in the location of the things that happen on the grid. Some places are more important than others, where there's congestion or locational deficits. The amount of variation in the value due to interactions that I just showed you between DERs, so that you capture those interactions between DERs themselves. And then secondly, make sure that you've got the benefits established over their full effective lives, so that you're looking at them as any other resource, whether it's 15 or 20 or 5 years or 2, and account for variations due to interactions between DERs and other system resources. All of that means that in the end, using DERs as a competitive resource in capacity expansion modeling is probably necessary to get a better fix on what their full value is. If we move to the next slide, please. I think that's the final one. We put a little table in, sort of a consumer reports table in the report, that not all values are created equal. Not all need to be looked at in every aspect of the 3 components of the utility system: distribution planning, generation planning, and transmission planning. More or less emphasis needs to be placed on various ones of these recommendations. For example, the variations valued due to specific locations on the grid are less important for generation planning than they are for transmission and distribution planning. So this little grid gives you a sense of, depending on what you're doing, whether a particular value proposition needs to be focused on or not. And I will stop there so we can let Margot take on.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was an excellent presentation and gives you know, a bigger picture overview of how utilities are really valuing GEBs as a grid asset. And let's advance in the interest of time. So I want to hand this over to Margot Everett, and she's going to dive into incentive mechanisms or financial mechanisms for leveraging demand flexibility as a grid asset. Margot?
Thank you, Rose. So moving to the first slide. The report that is available really starts talking about the ecosystem and who the key players are. So I'm going to do this key stakeholders. I'm going to go through this very quickly. Stakeholders include not just the utilities and customers, but regulators who have policy objectives that they're trying to move forward, and grid operators who are trying to optimize the grid and make sure that the reliability needs of the grid are met. Of course, we have utilities. A subset of service providers are aggregators. These are an emerging group of entities that bring customers together collectively and supply them as a single entity. Of course, customers, as I already mentioned. And then lastly, key stakeholder in GEB buildings are contractors and third-party operators, so the people who actually help install these systems and operate them on behalf of the customer. So these are the key players. Now, and if we move on to the next slide, we really want to make sure that we understand sort of the abilities of a GEB building. And this has been established by the DOE. There's 5 of them. Basically, efficiency, reducing costs, load shedding, getting a customer to use less during certain periods of time, load shifting, moving electricity use from one period to another, and then modulating, which is just sort of balancing power and being and sort of stabilizing the customer's use. Lastly is generation, which is the ability to generate behind the meter and self-provide. So these are the 5 things that Geb buildings can do. So moving to the next slide, we start to ask ourselves, what are the types of options that you can have, program options that you can have and create and incentive mechanisms given that flexibility. So there's really kind of 2 main buckets. The first is what we would call non-dispatchable, also known in the industry as load modifying. And this tends to be a price-based program that is sending customers signals about how they, what the market is doing, what the system needs through pricing mechanisms, and then the customer responds. The second is dispatchable. These are more programs that look and feel a little bit more like an asset for the utility. They are market informed, so they're being dispatched based off of market information, and they tend to be incentive based, meaning that they provide monetary compensation to participants by performance or maybe just participation. So if we look at non-dispatchable, back again, price-based, really you're talking about utility rates. It's, you can have different types of rates, and as Tom was talking about, things like time of use rates and volumetric rates that are sending price signals to customers to change the volume that they're using at a particular time are quite useful. On the other side of the spectrum are subscription rates, which are rates that are designed to incent customers to maybe install different types of energy efficiency technologies in exchange for getting some fixed pricing, or basically a subscription can also be kind of a demand-based rate where the customer pays a fixed amount every month based off of what they expect to be their energy use, and then they manage their energy use to that subscription level. On the dispatchable side, you really have 2 forms. The first is one that's sort of run by the utility and kind of your traditional utility operator programs. Examples of these are things like load control programs, going back to in the day where we're used to have air conditioner shedding programs. That would be an example of load control. Water heater controls is another one. In that same bucket are these sort of customer or aggregator programs where an aggregator will bring together a group of customers and try to get that group of customers to consistently deliver demand response savings over a period of time in exchange for compensation. So these programs typically will have a participation type mechanism where the customer gets a discount on their bill, or they are given the technology for free to have the load control, to have some control over some of their assets. There can be performance-based mechanisms in these types of programs as well. In other words, if a customer doesn't actually respond, that even though they have the controls are in place, the customer's response isn't there, then the customer's incentive is not as great as it would be if they had responded. Lastly, you have sort of these what I would call wholesale market-driven programs. This is where the resource is now fully integrated into the wholesale market. It responds just like every other asset that's on the grid. It provides, and therefore it can provide additional services like ancillary services, capacity, and energy markets. So, and so a really good example of these types are things like battery storage. And going back, linking it back to what Tom said in integrated resource planning, this last component here is really talking about having DERs be a part of the resource plan and treated like a resource or an asset for the grid, while the other 2 are more on the customer side, trying to influence customer behavior and hopefully modify how the grid needs to respond. Moving to the next slide, what we're going to do here is talk a little bit about utility rates now and how they kind of come into the picture. So We have some traditional rate designs here. Volumetric is the most common rate design that you will see. What this basically is $1 per kilowatt hour charge. This charge can be flat, meaning it's the same for every hour of every day, or regardless. Or it can maybe be a seasonal rate, like, you know, pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour in the summer and 8 cents a kilowatt hour in the winter. Then you have the more advanced time-based volumetric rates where the price actually does vary by season and time of day. So prices at 2 in the afternoon might be higher than they are at 2 in the morning. Demand charges are also somewhat traditional, although you typically only see them with larger commercial industrial customer rates. Residential and small commercial customers don't quite understand demand charges, so you don't typically see demand charges in those class rates. And then there's basically two types. One is what we would call the coincident peak, so a cost that corresponds with the customer's consumption during the system peak and when the system is peaking. The non-coincident peak just is when the customer is peaking, and different system needs are driven by coincident versus non-coincident. So for example, generation tends to be coincident peak demand driven, while distribution capacity tends to be non-coincident peak driven because it's driven more by the local load of individual groups of customers at certain spots in the distribution system. As we move to more alternative rates, you're seeing more and more interest in what we call dynamic rates. These are rates that change can change maybe, you know, a couple times a year or every day. So real-time pricing, that's clearly, you know, the rate is being set the day ahead, and customers are getting that signal and planning their energy usage for the next day, while event-based pricing is saying tomorrow is going to be a particularly painful day on the grid. We would like customers to conserve as much as possible. So we're going to raise overall price for consuming electricity tomorrow and hopefully get customers to conserve. One of the challenges of event-based pricing, by the way, is that it can work for certain periods of time, but you do have a challenge of customer fatigue, and we'll get into that in a minute. Lastly, there's subscription, which is sort of, again, the opposite side, which is, you know, really trying to focus on getting customers a little bit more bill stability while still sending them the right price signals around how much they use. So they can basically think about it as your data plan. You can go out there and say, I'm going to use 10 kilowatts of power, and I'll pay for 10 kilowatts of power. And so I will manage my energy use to keep myself under 10 kW. Similarly, technology subscription, these are rates where a customer might install a smart thermostat, and because they've installed a smart thermostat, they get the subscription rate that gives them some benefits to because that customer is using technology to manage their load. They don't necessarily need to receive the price signal. Moving on to the next slide, we have which one of these types of rate designs align with GEB strategies, meaning which ones are best for a GEB building. So real-time pricing is probably nirvana for a GEB building. You know, a day ahead, the building operator knows what the prices are going to be for every hour of that day, and they can manage their building controls. They can manage the EV charging, their storage, PV production, as well as comfort levels and managing temperature within the building. So real-time pricing is quite beneficial to a GEB building, followed by event-based, again, because they have that responsiveness. On the least aligned is a flat volumetric rate, because with a flat volumetric rate, it doesn't matter when the customer consumes, it's always the same price, and so there's no incentive, and so there's no way to monetize the value of a GEB technology in these types of programs. Moving on to the next type of program, let's quickly looking at barriers. You know, one of the things that we see is that, you know, market signals can be muddled. It's a bit challenging to get customers these types of price signals in a way that makes sense for them. State regulators still, one of the challenges is that the utility business model is not necessarily conducive to promoting these types of programs. And so regulators need to be thinking differently about how utilities make money so that utilities are incented to provide these types of programs. Next slide is the modern rate architecture slide. So what we're doing here is we're as a solution to rate design, you don't necessarily have to say, oh, time of use rate's the best rate. What we introduce here with the modern rate architecture concept is borrowing upon pricing theory that's used in other types of industries. First step is to understand the product that you're selling to your customers and what is that product and what does that mean? What are you really providing? And then understanding the costs of that product. So you truly understand what it is that you're delivering and what it costs. And then the last step in that sort of the three-step process here is customer segmentation. So you want to look at how your customers are using the products and have you segmented your customers differently. We tend to, as an industry, have the same customer classes for the last 120 years, industrial, commercial, residential. We're starting to see the use of customer class as a way of managing rate design. In particular in California, they introduced an commercial electric vehicle customer class to address this very issue, because customer classes are no longer holding together the way they have historically. From there, you do pricing design and incentive design, and we separate these two because it's very important to not muddle signals in what is a price, which is to reflect cost, versus what is an incentive, which is to promote customer behavior changes for adopting technologies for a short period of time. So incentive design, it's very important to separate that out so that the utilities can understand what the incentives that they're offering, customers see it, there's more transparency, and over time, when technology adoption has improved, you can reduce the amount of the incentive. Moving to the next one real quick, we're going to talk a little bit about operator programs, which basically you can think of them as performance-based, participant-based, or voluntary behavior. So really what we're saying here is that if you participate in this program and you save X kilowatt hours, you might get Y dollars. That's performance-based. So there's a direct correlation between what the customer does and the amount of incentive that they get. Participant-based is a little bit more conventional. That's the one where, hey, if you let me put an air conditioner control on your and I can shed your air conditioner, you'll get $10 a month credit. And it doesn't matter whether or not the customer's air conditioner was on when you wanted to shed it or not. There's no performance base to it. And then lastly, voluntary behavior. This is where customers actually change their behavior in response to a program, such as the example that we've talked about quickly with some sort of peak day curtailment. I'm going to bump through the next slide, which I think is talking about so the alignment. Again, performance-based is most aligned with Geb strategies. What you want to do is create options for Geb buildings to monetize the value of the asset that they bring to the grid, and it helps to pay for the technologies that the Geb building installs. So performance-based is most aligned, while behavioral is the least. Going on to the next slide, we have the barriers against state policies are part of the challenge. Regulators really, again, the idea that the business model isn't aligned with utilities optimizing these types of technologies, and acknowledging the fact that customer assets, such as a Geb building, have value to the grid, but utilities are compensated based off of the assets they bring to the grid. So that's the main barrier. You can read the rest as you want to go through our report. The next slide, we have market structure. So this is the third type, where you basically have capacity and emergency services, ancillary services, and energy markets that provide different opportunities for Geb buildings to participate. They can, kind of going back to Tom's comment, capacity would be that the Geb building is actually integrated as an asset into the grid, while ancillary services means that the building is able to respond much like assets on the grid respond. So ancillary services would be things like load following and spinning reserve. So these are the 4 different types. And if we go to the next slide, you can see how they stack up against the GEB strategies, where capacity emergency service is most aligned, because there you can identify that the GEB building is providing capacity relief and give them some longer term incentive structures, similar to the 5-year program that Tom was talking about, where you give them benefits for providing the capacity relief over time. While ancillary services, ultra-fast response, it's very difficult for these buildings to provide that level of service. It tends to still be something that conventional generation utility or ISO monitored generation creates. Next slide. Some of the barriers again here is, again, the business model inertia is part of the problem. Another is really inconsistent DER treatment. There really isn't a consistent way of thinking about DERs and how you plan for them, how you treat them. And I think, Tom talked about this as well. So you can see that, if we can get to a more consistent way about thinking about DERs and incorporate them as assets on the grid and in utility planning, you would start to see more programs that would be beneficial for GEB buildings. Next slide. So if we look at overall goal alignment amongst the various different stakeholders that we talked about, where we see the greatest alignment is in predictability, that GEB buildings and rate design structures, you can create consistency and ability to anticipate bill savings. This is very important for many of the entities, because they're making an investment here in this technology, and they want to be able to say that they're going to be able to save X dollars on their bill because they have invested in these technologies, and really be able to monetize that over time. So that's one of the key alignment areas. Other places where you have good alignment with stakeholder goals and incentive mechanisms is reliability, bill cost savings, and occupant satisfaction. So overall, there's some fairly good, the good news is that there's a lot of win-win opportunities here with GEB buildings and utility rate design, and utilities, by adopting things like the modern rate architecture, can start to think differently about how they design rates and design customer programs. So a little bit of a sip from a fire hose there, but it got us there with 2 minutes to spare for questions.
Thanks so much, Margot. Yeah, we have got 2 minutes. We have a few questions that have come in. So maybe we can quickly fire those off. Joyce, do you want to jump in on the questions?
Sure, we have a couple of questions. One for Margot, although I'm sure Tom could probably speak to this as well. When are the real-time prices actually locked in? Is it on a day-ahead basis? And what's the confidence level in actually seeing those prices if you're trying to respond to them?
Right, so it depends on the market, but most markets, wholesale markets, will have an active day-ahead market where they publish a rate that, so like for example in California, it's published by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And that rate actually applies to the load commitments that entities have made. So what happens is there's this competitive bidding process that goes through to generate those rates. And then anybody who said, I'm going to consume 10 kilowatt hours in this hour, anybody who said, I'm going to generate 10 kilowatt hours in this hour will receive that rate. So it's actually a locked in rate. And then there's more dynamic rates that happen during the day. The actual day real time hourly rates, 15-minute rates, 5-minute rates, those rates tend to be more oriented towards balancing. They tend to be a very small percentage of the overall market, meaning the number of kilowatt hours that are exposed to those prices is pretty small. So, but those rates actually get locked in a day ahead basis. And just for some reference, you can start to look at in California, the IOUs are starting to develop real-time pricing programs specifically for electric vehicles. So you can check out PG&E's program. They've got some real-time EV programs. And there's a lot of dialogue going on around real-time pricing for commercial industrial customers in the state as well.
If the remaining audience has an extra 2 minutes, maybe we can get to these last 2 questions and then we will wrap it up.
Yeah, a question for Tom. Curious if you can speak to the importance of the standards for evaluation and measurement and verification. How critical are developing standards for that?
Well, I think the short answer is that there's an upside and a downside to grid integrated savings. The downside is that they could be highly variable depending upon people's responses to price signals and what have you. The benefit is that we have probably better measurement capability, M&B capability of those, because they have controls that can be trend documented, and so the standardization of the ways to process information, get baselines established before a building undergoes a transition to some incentive rate structure that it might be on for capacity savings, for example. We have better measurement capability because the controls can be monitored, and we won't have to go back and statistically tease it out. We'll be able to measure it directly. So that's the upside. And the third document that I talked to lays out in some detail, the C action document that I referenced, lays out in some detail the methods by which we can do that.
And what can public utility commissions do to start improving the valuation process and help to incorporate that into the utility integrated resource planning processes?
I think Margot is better equipped to talk about that than I am. In terms of incentivizing state actions, regulatory actions.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple things. Standardization of cost-benefit methodologies is certainly something that has been practiced in the industry for over 40 years, and just updating those methodologies, I think, is in order. There's the standard practice manuals, and there's some other states that have similar activities that they're doing. Incentive mechanisms for utilities, though, is going to be a major barrier because the commissions can mandate activities, but the utilities will be reluctant to do a lot of programs, in part because they're concerned about what the implications are on their earnings. As we start to have non-utility assets being integrated and substituting for utility assets. So it's sort of twofold. There's the evaluation side, but then there's sort of also rethinking the business model. Does that help?
All right, we are 3 minutes over, and I just want to thank you both, Tom and Margot, for your contributions to today's call. It's a wealth of information right here. If any of the audience members has additional questions, feel free to reach out to myself and Joyce McLaren, and we can forward those questions on to our panelists today. Thanks everybody for your participation, and again, thank you to our presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you.